It was a regular Tuesday night. The kind that slips through memory unnoticed, until something irreversible happens. James Tillman had just clocked out from a diner shift. The night air was cool, the sidewalks nearly empty. He was listening to music, probably thinking about what to eat when he got home. He didn't know someone had just been murdered 2 blocks away. 10 minutes later, police lights lit up the street. A call had gone out. A young woman was assaulted and left for dead. Witnesses were shaky. Fear spread fast. Officers stopped the first young black man they saw in the vicinity. They asked where he'd been. He told them. They didn't believe him. That's how it starts. A moment. A misstep. A name written into history as the wrong one. This is the story of James Tillman, and how he lost 18 years of his life to a crime he didn't see and didn't commit. It was just after 10:20 p.m. when James Tillman pushed open the creaky glass door of the diner on Franklin Avenue. He had wiped down the last table, emptied the trash, and clocked out like he did every other night. He was 19, young, quiet, and mostly invisible to the city that buzzed around him. That night, he had no plans except walking home, the same 2-mile route he'd taken dozens of times before. His headphones were snug, low-volume jazz drifting into his ears, drowning out the hum of passing cars and the occasional bark of a dog behind a chain-link fence. It was just a walk home, nothing more, nothing less. But that night, silence had teeth. 3 blocks away, someone screamed. But James didn't hear it. At the other end of Edgewood Street, a woman was running barefoot. Her face was bloodied, her dress torn, and panic exploded from her lungs like fire. Neighbors peeked through curtains. One man called 911. Another ran outside and draped a blanket over her shoulders. She was sobbing so hard she couldn't get the words out. But one thing she said stuck. He was black. He had a white t-shirt, and just like that, the hunt began. James was about 6 minutes from the scene when 2 patrol cars cornered him near a corner store, blue lights pulsing off the walls like a warning. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He took off his headphones, confused. One officer asked him to stop. Another pulled out his flashlight. James blinked. The officer asked where he was coming from. James pointed to the diner. He had his receipt in his wallet. He tried to explain he had just finished his shift. They told him to face the wall. He asked what was going on. They said he matched a description: black male, white shirt. That was enough. They searched him right there on the sidewalk. No weapon. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Still, they put him in cuffs. He asked if they could call the diner manager. They told him to be quiet. As they pushed him into the back of the cruiser, a woman across the street watched from her window. She remembered that boy. He'd been working at the diner for over a year. Polite. Always gave her exact change. But she didn't say anything. Nobody did. At the precinct, James was placed in a cold holding room. The walls were a pale yellow, like they'd once been cheerful but had long since given up. Hours passed. They didn't let him call anyone. No lawyer. No manager. No family. They kept asking him the same questions. Where were you between 10 and 10:30? Did you see anyone running? Were you on Edgewood? He kept answering. The same words. I was walking home. I didn't see anything. I swear. They didn't believe him. Meanwhile, the victim, 26-year-old Claire McGregor, was being treated at the hospital. Her injuries were serious. She'd been attacked from behind, dragged into an alley. The police took her statement as she lay in a hospital bed, struggling to speak through tears and trauma. She didn't know the attacker. She only caught glimpses. She remembered brown skin. A white shirt. medium height. She remembered his breath smelled like tobacco. She said he'd whispered something in her ear, but she couldn't make it out. Hours later, they brought her a photo lineup. 6 pictures. James's mugshot, fresh from that night, was in the middle. She hesitated. Her hand hovered. Then she pointed to James. "I think that's him," she said. That was enough. The next morning, James was officially charged with assault, attempted rape, and attempted murder. His bail was set so high his family couldn't even dream of paying it. His public defender met him only once before the arraignment. The man glanced at the police report, nodded, and told James to stay calm in court. He would do his best. James sat behind a scratch table in a brown jumpsuit, staring at the floor. He was still in shock. His mother sat 3 rows back, holding a Bible, whispering prayers. His sister clutched her hoodie strings so tightly her knuckles turned white. The prosecution painted him as a predator. They said he stalked the streets waiting for the right moment. They said the victim had no reason to lie. James didn't even know her name until the arraignment. Nobody checked the diner's cameras. Nobody interviewed his co-workers. Nobody traced the steps between the diner and the crime scene to see if it was even physically possible. They had a victim pointing. They had a suspect who looked close enough. That was all they needed. James was sent to county jail while waiting for trial. Their nights were louder. The walls echoed with yelling, metal clanks, and distant sobbing. He learned quickly how to keep his head down. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He spent most of his time thinking about how this had happened. He replayed that walk home in his mind over and over, like it was a puzzle he was too blind to solve. Where had he gone wrong? What did he miss? His first court date was postponed. Then another. Then another. Months passed. He missed Thanksgiving, Christmas, his sister's birthday. His mother visited when she could, her eyes red from sleepless nights. She always told him to pray. That truth would win. That this was just a mistake. But James was starting to realize, mistakes don't fix themselves. Especially not in courtrooms. When trial finally began, nearly 10 months after his arrest, the prosecution leaned heavily on the victim's identification. They called it positive. They said she had no motive to lie. A forensic expert testified there was no DNA match, but framed it carefully, saying it neither confirms nor eliminates the suspect. The defense brought in the diner manager, who confirmed James had worked that night. But his testimony was shaky. He didn't remember exactly when James left. Could have been 10, maybe 10:15. He wasn't sure. The defense also submitted James's time card. But the prosecution argued he could have committed the crime after clocking out. That it was plausible. No fingerprints. No DNA. No witnesses saw him at the scene. No blood on his clothes. Still, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. On all counts, James didn't cry when they read the verdict. He sat there, frozen. Like his soul had left his body, and he was just watching the trial from somewhere else. His mother gasped. His sister screamed. And just like that, at age 20, James Tillman was sentenced to 45 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was just walking home. Prison wasn't just bars and schedules, it was a different planet. The sound of keys, the clang of gates, the low hum of restless men pacing concrete floors became James's new world. He was 20 years old when he arrived at the correctional facility in Somers, Connecticut. He had never even spent a night in jail before that false arrest. Now he was surrounded by hardened lifers, some who had committed the kinds of crimes he had only seen on the news. But he wasn't one of them. He didn't belong there, and every second reminded him of it. His first day, a guard handed him a pair of boots that didn't fit and a prison number that replaced his name. He was shown his cell, 6 feet by 9 feet of concrete, with a stained mattress and a flickering light above. There was no privacy, no silence, no peace. Just noise. And the weight of years he hadn't even begun to feel yet. The other inmates sized him up immediately. Some saw a kid. Others saw a target. But most didn't care. James kept to himself, afraid that any misstep could get him hurt. Or worse, that he tried to explain his innocence at first. To guards. To cellmates. To anyone who would listen. But soon he realized how useless that was. In prison, everyone says they're innocent. It doesn't matter if it's true. The more he said it, the less people believed him. So he stopped talking about it. He buried the truth deep inside, like a broken piece of glass he couldn't risk showing to anyone. Months passed, then years. Time in prison didn't move forward. It just circled. The same walls, same faces, same routine. James learned to wake before the morning count. He learned how to avoid eye contact without looking weak. He learned how to fold his uniform just right so the guards wouldn't punish him for disrespect. He learned how to disappear into routine. Because in prison, blending in is survival. His mother visited as often as she could. She aged faster than she should have. Her hair grayed within 3 years. She brought him books, updates from home, and stories about his sister starting community college. Every visit ended the same way: a long hug, a whispered prayer, and the promise that one day, someone would believe him. That one day, the truth would come out. James wanted to believe that too. But as the appeals failed, one after another, hope began to wither. His public defenders changed often, none staying long enough to fully grasp the case. They called it unfortunate, but unwinnable. He memorized phrases like insufficient grounds denied due to lack of new evidence, and case closed unless substantial proof emerges. Words that felt like iron doors slamming shut. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness. It was the silence from the world outside. Friends stopped writing. People forgot. Even the news moved on. James would sometimes stare at the small window in his cell, wondering how many people were walking free outside while the real attacker, whoever he was, lived untouched, unnoticed. The system had chosen James. The world had accepted it. But there was one person who didn't forget: his sister, Kiara. She had been just 13 when James was arrested. Now in her 20s, she had become a paralegal, motivated by what had happened to her brother. She started digging. Quietly at first. She read every line of his trial transcripts. She interviewed his former coworkers. She researched similar crimes in the same area and found something no one had noticed before. 3 months before James's arrest, another woman had been attacked just a mile from where Claire McGregor was assaulted. The MO was nearly identical: grabbed from behind, dragged into an alley, bruised but survived. The suspect in that case had never been found. The sketch from that attack didn't look like James. But no one had ever compared the two cases. Kiara contacted a local law clinic, hoping someone would take interest. Most didn't. But one in turn passed the case to a senior staffer named Cynthia Reyes. Cynthia had worked on wrongful conviction cases before and agreed to meet with Kiara. They talked for hours. Cynthia reviewed the files and immediately saw red flags: the shaky witness ID, the lack of physical evidence, the ignored alibi. She filed a formal request to access the police evidence archive for James's case. What they discovered changed everything. In a small, sealed bag was the original clothing worn by the victim the night of the attack, never tested for DNA. The police had collected it but never sent it to the lab. No one had requested testing. No one had bothered. Cynthia filed a motion to have it examined. The prosecution resisted at first. Claimed it was unnecessary, since the case was settled. But Cynthia pressed, and eventually the judge agreed. Months passed. James had no idea any of this was happening. The letters Kiara sent were delayed, some lost. He thought she had stopped fighting. He thought maybe she had given up like everyone else. Until the day he was called to the warden's office. A man in a suit was waiting. James had never seen him before. The man introduced himself as part of the Innocence Project legal team. He explained the new DNA findings. Male DNA was found on the victim's clothing. It didn't match James. It matched someone else, a man named Leonard Mathis, a convicted felon who had assaulted a woman in a nearby city just a year after James was imprisoned. James didn't speak. He couldn't. The world tilted beneath him. For 18 years he had waited to hear something, anything, that meant someone finally believed him. And now, this stranger was saying it aloud. He was innocent. But the story wasn't over. Because even with the DNA, even with the match, the state refused to drop the charges immediately. They claimed, "The presence of another man's DNA does not conclusively exonerate Mr. Tillman." Cynthia called it a disgrace. James called it exactly what he expected. It took another 11 months, multiple court hearings, and national media attention before the charges were dropped. The judge declared James Tillman factually innocent. He was released that same day. There were reporters outside. His sister was crying. His mother had passed away the year before, never getting to see this moment. James walked out of prison with one bag, a stale sandwich from the commissary, and the weight of nearly 2 decades stolen. Freedom didn't feel like it should. It was loud, disorienting. Everyone expected him to smile, to speak. But how do you explain what it feels like to be erased? That night, he slept in a real bed for the first time in 18 years. He didn't sleep at all. The first thing James noticed when he walked into the free world wasn't the sky or the wind or the sound of traffic. It was the silence. Not the silence of confinement, but a strange, echoing emptiness. No metal clinks. No guards yelling. No keys dangling from belts. Just space. And uncertainty. The world he had left behind in 1989 was gone. The buildings were taller. Cars looked like spaceships. Everyone stared down at glowing rectangles in their hands. The city had moved on, evolved, forgotten him. And now, at nearly 40 years old, James Tillman was expected to start over in a world that no longer spoke his language. Kiara had turned their mother's old apartment into a quiet sanctuary for him. Photos were still on the wall. A blanket their mom had crocheted was folded neatly on the couch. James walked slowly through the living room like he was visiting a museum of someone else's life. In a way, he was. He had aged, but not grown. Everything he knew stopped the night he was arrested. There was no driver's license, no bank account, no resume. 18 years had passed, but for James, it felt like only a few long, suffocating nights. The first week, he didn't leave the house. Crowds made him anxious. Sirens made him flinch. He struggled to sleep, even in silence. The dreams were loud, screaming, cell doors slamming, the echo of that guilty verdict repeated in a loop. He would jolt awake, covered in sweat, confused about where he was. Freedom, he learned, comes in layers. You don't just walk into it. You have to fight your way into believing it's real. Kiara sat with him every night. She talked about how much she had missed him, how hard she had worked, how proud their mom would have been. She never once asked him to be okay. She just let him exist. Sometimes they sat in silence, the TV on low in the background, and that was enough. But the world outside didn't wait. Soon came the interviews. The headlines. Men freed after 18 years. Wrongful conviction overturned. News vans parked outside their building. James hated it. To the public, he was a symbol now. A walking reminder of justice delayed. But he wasn't a headline. He was a man trying to remember how to live. Reporters wanted him to cry on camera. Some wanted him to forgive the system that broke him. Others wanted him angry. He wasn't ready to be either. The state offered him a settlement, $1.4 million. That number looked massive on paper, but James saw something else. They had calculated the value of his youth. His 20s. His 30s. His mother's funeral. His sister's graduation. All of it reduced to a check with too many commas and not enough meaning. He took it. What else could he do? But the money didn't fix anything. It didn't give him back time. It didn't erase what he had endured. He used part of the settlement to build a small community center in Hartford. Nothing flashy, just a clean, quiet place where at-risk teens could do homework, get job coaching, or just sit and feel safe. He named it Margaret's Place, after his mother. He didn't talk much about why he built it. He just showed up every day, helped clean the floors, set out chairs, and made coffee for whoever wandered in. Slowly, the pieces began to come together. He got a driver's license. Took night classes in graphic design. He learned how to use a smartphone, although he hated typing with his thumbs. He started walking again. Sometimes he'd walk the same path he used to take home from the diner, retracing the steps that led to his arrest. He never made it to the exact spot. His legs always stopped him a block too soon. Something in him still refused to cross that invisible line. But even as his life began to rebuild, a question haunted him. What happened to Leonard Mathis? The man whose DNA was found on Claire McGregor's clothes. The man whose criminal record included assault, kidnapping, and multiple restraining orders. The man who lived just blocks from the crime scene in 1989. When the Innocence Project traced his records, they found a disturbing pattern. After James was arrested, Leonard had moved to New Haven. In 1991, he was accused of attempting to abduct a woman outside a laundromat. No charges were filed. In 1994, another woman came forward, claiming he had stalked her for weeks. Still nothing stuck. He was arrested in 1998 for assaulting his girlfriend. Served 3 years. He was released just 6 months before James walked free. The more James learned, the more nauseous he became. Not because Leonard existed, but because the system knew, and still didn't care. The prosecutor who had tried James retired years earlier. The lead detective had passed away. No one wanted to reopen the case. Claire McGregor, the victim, had moved out of state. She never contacted James, never made a public statement after his release. Maybe she didn't want to. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she, too, was a victim of a broken system that forced her to point at someone just to get closure. James didn't blame her. Not anymore. But he did blame the silence. Why hadn't they followed the DNA? Why hadn't Leonard been brought in for questioning, at the very least? How could they know the real attacker's name, and still let him vanish into obscurity? James wanted to scream. But screaming had never helped him. So instead, he wrote letters. Dozens of them. To the district attorney's office. To the governor. To news outlets. Some responded with apologies. Others didn't respond at all. No charges were ever filed against Leonard Mathis for the 1989 assault. He died of liver failure in 2010. James learned this through an obituary clipped from an old newspaper. It didn't mention any of his crimes. Just his children, his church, and the job he'd held for 15 years. It was like reading about a stranger. A clean slate. A life that had moved forward while James had sat in a cage. There would be no trial. No justice. No full circle. The man who stole his future died free. James didn't tell anyone he visited Leonard's grave. He found it in a quiet cemetery, unremarkable, a simple stone. He stood there for a long time. Not in hatred. Not even anger. Just grief. Not for the man, but for the truth that never had its day in court. For the decades that ended in silence. For his mother, who had prayed for this moment and never lived to see it. For himself, before he left, he whispered, "You know what you did? And so do I." And he never went back. James started waking up before dawn again, not because of prison routines, but because something in him still believed someone might come through the door and tell him it was all a mistake. That they had changed their minds. That he had to go back. Every morning light filtered through his blinds, soft and golden, but it never felt real. It felt like a trick, like freedom was something fragile that could be taken away just as easily as it had been given. He'd walk outside most mornings, breathe in the air, touch the rough bark of the trees by the curb just to remind himself he wasn't behind concrete anymore. His apartment was small, 2 rooms, 2nd floor, but it was quiet and his. The first thing he did when he moved in was take off the bedroom door. It reminded him too much of a cell. He liked the openness, the flow. The first night he slept there, he left the light on, door open, windows cracked. Still, sleep didn't come easily. There was no guidebook for what to do after losing nearly 2 decades to the wrong prison sentence. Some days he felt like trying. Other days he stared at the ceiling for hours. Kiara checked in constantly, but she never hovered. She knew his quiet wasn't silence, it was survival. She invited him to dinners, offered rides, shared articles about exonerated men building new lives. James always nodded. He always said he'd think about it. But most days he didn't go. He spent hours in libraries, not reading for escape but for answers. He wanted to understand the justice system that had failed him. He read books on eyewitness error, confirmation bias, faulty memory recall. He studied how trauma distorts faces, how lineups are influenced by suggestion. He devoured articles on the Innocence Project and similar organizations, learning that there were hundreds, thousands, of men like him. Locked away, screaming their truth into a system built not to hear them. What terrified him most wasn't that he had been wrongly convicted. It was how easily it had happened. How normal it all seemed. How quickly people stopped asking questions once they had someone to blame. He began journaling late at night, writing down everything he remembered about the trial, the investigation, the faces of the officers who arrested him. Their voices, their mannerisms, the pauses they took before answering. He tried to remember it all with surgical precision. Not because he wanted revenge, but because the truth had nearly disappeared once. He wasn't going to let it happen again. Then one afternoon, something happened that James hadn't expected. A woman knocked on his door. Early 30s, nervous eyes, hands shaking as she clutched a file folder. She introduced herself as Ellen Givens. She was a law student from Boston working on a thesis about wrongful convictions and systemic bias. She had read about James in an old case study and tracked him down, not for an interview, not for a project, but because her father had been on the jury that convicted him. James froze. She said her father, Thomas Givens, had passed away 2 years ago. Near the end of his life, he had confessed that he was never fully convinced of James's guilt. He had wanted to vote. Not guilty, but the others had pressured him. Said it was better to be safe. That he fit the description. And the girl picked him out. Her father regretted it every day since. Ellen said he had written about it in a letter she found after he died. He called it the great shame of my life. James didn't know what to say. He invited her in. They sat at the table. She handed him the letter. It was dated 15 years after his conviction, long before DNA cleared his name. In it, Thomas wrote about that deliberation room. The way fear won. The way doubt was buried. The way one man's hesitation wasn't enough to save another man's future. He wrote James's name at the top of the letter, not defendant, not suspect, just his name. Reading it, James felt his chest tighten. It wasn't closure. But it was something. Proof that the truth had always existed, even if it had been too quiet to matter. Ellen asked if she could help somehow. James said she already had. That night, he didn't dream about the cell. Instead, he dreamed of his mother's hands. The next morning, James walked to Margaret's place. He stood outside for a long time before unlocking the door. The building smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. A few kids were already inside, playing checkers and arguing about music. One boy, no older than 15, asked James if he had been in prison. His friends elbowed him, but James didn't get angry. He nodded and said yes. The room went quiet. Then the boy asked why. James looked at him, really looked. And then he told him. Not everything, not the legal jargon or courtroom details, but enough. How someone picked him out. How nobody believed him. How it took 18 years for the truth to matter. When he finished, the boy didn't laugh or flinch. He just said, "That's messed up," and went back to his game, and that was it. Something shifted. James realized that his story wasn't just a tragedy, it was a shield. A warning. A truth too sharp to ignore. He began talking more at the center. Sharing parts of his experience with kids who didn't trust police, didn't trust the courts, didn't believe anything good could happen to them. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He just wanted them to know what could happen if nobody pays attention. One night, after a local reporter did a feature on Margaret's place, a former detective reached out anonymously through email. He didn't give his name, but James knew who he was. He had testified at James's trial, had helped make the arrest. The email was short. 3 sentences. "I've followed your story. I'm sorry. We were wrong." James didn't respond. He didn't need to, because now he had something more powerful than their apologies. He had proof. He had a name. He had his own voice, and it was finally being heard, and for the first time in years, James didn't just feel free. He felt real. The years that followed didn't heal everything, but they shaped James into someone he could finally recognize. Not the teenager in handcuffs. Not the inmate with dead eyes. But a man who had survived and decided to make survival mean something. Every morning still carried weight, but he no longer walked with a shadow stitched to his feet. Instead, he moved with quiet intention, each step grounded in a new kind of strength. The kind that comes from knowing the worst has already happened, and you're still here. Margaret's place had become more than just a community center. It became a refuge. Word spread. Kids came not because it was required, but because they felt seen. James never lectured. He listened. He let the kids talk. Let them vent about school, about police, about fear. Most of them had seen things no child should see. Some were one bad moment away from becoming a statistic. James knew what that looked like. He had lived it. A boy named Elijah started coming around every day after school. 15, smart, but angry in a way James recognized too well. His mother worked double shifts. His father was gone. He hated authority, hated his teachers, hated the rules. But every time he stormed in, James gave him space. Never punished him for being loud. Just waited. And slowly, Elijah started talking. About how he didn't trust anyone. About the time a cop accused him of stealing a phone just because he was standing near the scene. He said, "I don't matter to them." And James nodded, because he understood. But then he said something else. "You matter to us." That broke something in James he hadn't realized was still hard. All those years of feeling disposable. Reduced to a file. A photo in a lineup. And now, this kid, this young, defiant kid, was telling him he mattered. That what he built mattered. It was the first time in a long time that James cried. Not from grief. From weight. From release. One afternoon, a woman from the Innocence Project reached out again. They were hosting a panel on justice reform in Boston and asked if James would speak. He had turned down dozens of speaking requests before, but this time, something inside him said yes. Kiara drove him. She sat in the front row. As he stood behind the podium, hands trembling, he looked out at the crowd, activists, students, prosecutors, judges. The same kinds of people who had once looked at him like a threat. He took a deep breath and told his story. He didn't use notes. He didn't sanitize the pain. He talked about the night he was arrested. The years he lost. The weight of guilt he never earned. He talked about the dreams of his mother's hands. About Margaret's place. About Elijah. And when he finished, the room was so quiet he could hear someone sniffle in the back row. Afterward, people lined up to speak to him. Some thanked him. Some apologized. A retired judge pulled him aside and said his story had changed the way she would handle identification evidence in the future. That meant more to James than any headline ever could. But not everyone was moved. A few weeks later, James received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a short note, written in shaky handwriting. "Stop lying. You got lucky. You think you're innocent, but we all saw the girl pick you." No signature. Just that. It didn't surprise him. There were always people who clung to their beliefs harder than they clung to facts. James didn't get angry. He just folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with all the others he'd collected over the years. Letters from strangers, from inmates, from victims, from believers and skeptics alike. Each one reminded him that his story wasn't just his. It belonged to the public now. It lived in the space between guilt and doubt, in the cracks of a system that still hadn't fixed itself. Kiara kept pushing the envelope. She had joined a task force on prosecutorial oversight. She advocated for laws that required mandatory DNA testing when requested. She spoke on panels, did interviews, and never stopped mentioning James's name. For her, this fight wasn't over. It never would be. Because every case like James's was a signal. A siren. Together they helped launch a new program within Margaret's Place. A legal literacy clinic, where volunteer attorneys would teach young people how the justice system works, what to do if stopped by police, how to understand court documents, how to spot unlawful searches. James sat in on every session. He didn't speak much. But when he did, every kid listened. One day, as he was leaving the center, a woman waited for him outside. She was older now, her hair tied in a gray bun, her voice soft. She introduced herself as Claire McGregor. James froze. She said she didn't come to apologize. She wasn't sure that would help. But she had something to give him. A letter. She had written it years ago but never sent it. In it, she described the night of the attack. The confusion. The fear. The flashlight in her eyes during the lineup. How everything happened so fast. She wrote that when she saw his picture, she didn't feel certain, but they told her she had to choose. That if she didn't, he might hurt someone else. She said she didn't know if it was him. She said she always lived with that uncertainty. And when she found out about the DNA, she couldn't breathe for days. She said she was sorry, not just for what happened, but for never speaking up sooner. James listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he looked her in the eye and said thank you. Not for the apology, but for the courage it took to come. They didn't hug. They didn't make promises. She left, and James stood there under the streetlight, the letters still trembling in his hand. He had imagined that moment for years, but it never looked like this. It was softer, sadder, more human. And in that moment, James realized something else. Closure isn't something you get, it's something you choose. It rained the morning James stood in front of the old courthouse, the same one where he had once been sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that mute all sound and make the world feel smaller. He had driven there alone. Not for revenge. Not for spectacle. But because today, the state legislature was unveiling a new bill, the Wrongful Conviction Accountability Act. And James was going to watch it happen. He leaned against the stone column near the steps, wearing a plain gray coat, his hands tucked into his pockets. He wasn't speaking today. That role had gone to Kiara, who now stood at the podium, her voice echoing through the modest crowd as she named her brother's story not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. She spoke without notes, her voice steady and deliberate. My brother was innocent, but the system didn't care about innocence. It cared about closure. About moving on. It closed the file and called it justice. James had heard her say those words before, but standing there beneath that courthouse, surrounded by journalists, law students, and old politicians, they carried a different weight. People nodded. Some looked down. A few wiped their eyes. But James didn't cry. He couldn't. His tears had dried somewhere between the 11th and 12th year of prison. What he felt now was something else. Like the tight knot in his chest had finally started to loosen. The bill passed unanimously that day. It would allow new evidence to be reviewed without the burden of procedural limitations. It would mandate police departments to preserve biological evidence in violent crimes for the duration of a person's incarceration. And perhaps most importantly to James, it would prevent the same prosecutors who tried a case from opposing its review. Afterward, Kiara found him outside and wrapped her arms around him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence was its own language, carved from shared grief and unspoken victories. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to exhale, really exhale, as if he hadn't truly done so since he was 19. But the world didn't pause to congratulate him. The news cycle moved on. Politicians took their photo ops. The courtroom emptied. And James went back to Margaret's place that same evening, where a group of teenagers were arguing about whether the justice system could ever truly be fair. He sat with them. Quiet. Patient. Then one of the older girls asked him, Would you still call the police if you were in trouble? James took a moment before answering. He didn't want to lie. He didn't want to preach. Finally, he said, I'd call someone who listens. That answer stayed with her. It stayed with all of them, because James wasn't just someone who had suffered. He was someone who had learned how to listen in a world that keeps drowning out the quiet truth. The months that followed were filled with strange contradictions. James was asked to consult on documentaries. He received invitations to speak at universities. People sent him books to sign, quoted his interviews, turned his life into podcasts. Some called him inspiring. Others called him a cautionary tale. But none of those labels fit him. James wasn't a symbol. He was a man who lost half his life to an error that no one paid for. He never wanted attention. He just wanted truth to matter as much as convenience. James stared into the dark, then said softly, I did. For 18 years. And somehow I came back. Elijah didn't say anything. He just leaned against James's shoulder and sat with him until it was time to go, and that's how it was, most days. Small moments that didn't make headlines. Quiet exchanges that didn't go viral. But they mattered. They changed something. And in a world still heavy with injustice, that was enough. James never got the years back. Never got to bury his mother. Never went back to college. He didn't chase what was lost anymore. He built something instead. With each person he helped, with every law he fought to pass, with every child he convinced they were worth believing in, he built a future that wasn't dependent on forgetting the past, but on confronting it. And though he still had dreams, of cold cells and shadowed faces, he also had mornings now. Mornings with no chains, no gates, no numbers on his chest. Just the sound of birds, the warmth of sunlight, and the knowledge that the truth, his truth, had outlived the lie. James Tillman had been stolen. But he didn't vanish. He came back. And this time, the world would have to see him. The rain was softer now. It had been falling for hours, not in a storm, but in a steady rhythm that seemed to wash everything clean. James sat in the back pew of a church he hadn't stepped inside since his mother's funeral. The walls were the same. The windows still painted in muted blues and reds, light filtering through in soft beams. But he was different. And today wasn't about grief. It was about testimony. He hadn't planned to speak. It was a community event, a local forum on justice reform hosted by a group of volunteers who had taken an interest in what happened to him. But when the room grew quiet and someone asked, "Who here has lived it?" every head turned toward him. He stood slowly, unsure if his voice would hold. He didn't wear a suit. Didn't carry notes. Just a gray sweater and calloused hands. He started not with prison, but with his mother. How she prayed every night, hands shaking but voice strong. How she never once stopped believing in his innocence, even when the lawyers gave up. He told the story in pieces, letting the silence stretch between his sentences, letting the weight of each year land one by one. He spoke about the guards who never learned his name, only his number. About birthdays marked by echoing footsteps and cold concrete. About losing track of his own face. About waiting for a call that never came. And then, finally, about the DNA. About how it took science, not justice, to set him free. There was no dramatic ending. No applause. Just stillness. The kind that settles when truth finally lands. A few people wept. Others sat frozen, like they'd never heard the system described that way before. James stepped down, heart pounding, hands cold, and returned to his seat. He didn't want praise. He only wanted people to see what silence had cost. Afterward, a young woman approached him. She had tears in her eyes and said her brother had just been sentenced, 25 years. She didn't know if he was guilty. But she said now she was scared to believe either way. James didn't give her comfort. He didn't offer a quote or a cliché. He just nodded and said, "Keep asking questions. Even when it's hard. Because that's what the system depends on. People getting tired. People moving on. People assuming the courts got it right." But James knew better. Sometimes the courts didn't want truth. They wanted closure. And closure is often faster when someone, anyone, is named guilty. The next few weeks were quiet. James spent more time alone. Not because he was retreating, but because something inside him had shifted. There was a new responsibility now. Not just to tell his story, but to protect others from becoming a version of it. He began working with a National Innocence Coalition, mentoring exonerees struggling to adjust to life on the outside. Men who had missed their children's childhoods. Men who still woke in the middle of the night, reaching for a toothbrush locked in a plastic box. One man, Ernest, had served 31 years for a murder he didn't commit. His family had moved on. His daughter didn't remember him. He didn't know how to use a smartphone. Didn't know how to buy groceries without scanning a wristband. James became his anchor. Picked him up from bus stops. Helped him find shoes that fit. Helped him walk again, not just physically, but with purpose. James started compiling stories. Not just his own, but theirs. He wanted to put them in a book. Not for fame, but so the next person reading about a conviction wouldn't just see a mugshot, but a life. A soul. A system that got it wrong not once, but many times. He filled notebooks with handwritten accounts, each line a scar-turned sentence. But in all of it, one thing haunted him still, and no one had ever been held accountable. The prosecutor who built his case had retired with honors. The lead detective who shaped the lineup was never disciplined. The judge who denied his early appeals was now a consultant for private firms. Every person who had helped take his life had walked away untouched. James didn't want revenge. But he wanted the truth on record. So he started pushing for a state-level commission on prosecutorial accountability. Not to punish, but to expose. If a mechanic fails, your brakes don't work. If a prosecutor fails, someone disappears. There was resistance. Old colleagues called it unnecessary. Mistakes happen, they said. No system is perfect. But James wasn't talking about perfection. He was talking about human lives. About his life. One afternoon, while speaking at a local college, a student raised her hand and asked, "If you could go back, would you want your old life again?" James thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said. "Because I don't trust who I was to survive this. I only survived because I became someone else. Someone who learned how to live in the dark. Someone who learned how to rebuild in the daylight." That answer followed him home. It echoed in his sleep. It lived in his bones. He didn't want his old life. He wanted justice to be better than what he had endured. And until it was, he would keep speaking, even when his voice shook, even when it hurt, because silence had stolen enough from him already. The night before James was set to speak at the National Summit for Criminal Justice Reform, he sat alone in his apartment with the lights off. The streets below glowed orange from sodium lamps. The hum of traffic pulsed faintly through the window. On the table beside him lay a worn photograph of his mother, the same one he had kept folded in his Bible during all 18 years inside. Her smile was faded now, the corners creased from years of hands gripping it during sleepless nights. But it was still her. Still the woman who had written him every week without fail. Still the only person who had believed him from the first moment to her last breath. James hadn't prepared a speech. He never did. But tonight felt different. Not because of who would be listening, lawmakers, attorneys, reformers, but because of what he was finally ready to say. There had always been something he left out when telling his story. A part that didn't fit neatly into interviews or documentaries. Not because it was too painful, but because it was too raw. The shame, not his own, but the shame others had placed on him, wrapped around his name like barbed wire. For years after his release, even when the evidence cleared him, some people still looked at him with suspicion. A teacher once pulled a child away from him at a community event. A neighbor whispered to another when he walked by. It didn't matter what the DNA proved. The label of ex-con clung like smoke. You can be exonerated, James realized, but never truly unmarked. And then there were the quiet betrayals. People he grew up with who never visited. The cousin who said, "Well, maybe you were in the wrong place anyway." The pastor who stopped mentioning him during Sunday service. The silence from old friends who didn't know how to talk to someone who had lost so much and yet returned with a heart still beating. James had carried it all, without anger, but not without hurt. He had swallowed it, buried it, and moved forward. But now, he was ready to let it breathe. The next day, he stepped onto the stage. The auditorium was packed. A sea of faces, some familiar, many not. The moderator introduced him as a survivor of injustice, a voice for the silenced, and a builder of second chances. James didn't flinch at the praise. He didn't even smile. He just stepped up to the mic, adjusted it once, and began. He spoke slower than usual. Not because he was nervous, but because every word mattered. He spoke about the years, 6,575 days, to be exact, he spent behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. About the days that blurred together, the birthdays forgotten, the dreams that stopped coming. He described the hollow ache of watching life pass through a 4x10 window. But then he paused, and spoke about what came after, the loneliness of freedom, the confusion of modern life, the exhaustion of proving his innocence over and over again, even after the courts had said it. He talked about Margaret's place, about Kiara, about the letters from strangers and other inmates that filled his drawers, about the men who would never get their second chance, about the names he carried with him, Ernest, Marcus, Joseph, men who got out only to die alone, forgotten by the system that forgot them twice. Then he said something he hadn't said before. "I'm not lucky," he said. "Don't call it that. Luck is winning the lottery. I survived because people refused to stop fighting. My sister. My mother. A law intern who cared enough to read one more page. This wasn't luck. This was justice dragging itself out of a grave someone else buried it in." The room was still. James looked up, his voice firmer now. "Justice isn't blind. It's tired. It's rushed. It's overworked. And sometimes it's afraid. Afraid to admit it got it wrong. But if we keep treating mistakes like rare accidents instead of symptoms of a broken machine, then more people will end up where I was. Or worse, die there." He didn't cry. He never did in public. But his voice broke just once, when he said her name. Margaret. A few people in the front row bowed their heads. He closed with a quiet truth. "I lost everything. But I'm still here. Not because of the courts. Not because of the state. But because people made noise. People didn't give up. And if you remember nothing else from my story, remember that silence is what allows this to happen again. So be loud." The applause didn't erupt, it rolled in slowly, like a wave building from the back of the room. Not out of pity. Not out of guilt. But respect. James walked off the stage and didn't look back. He didn't need to. That night he walked home. Alone. No car. No cameras. Just the cold night air brushing against his face. He took the long way back, passing by an alley that looked too much like the one from 1988. He stopped. Not because he was afraid, but because he finally wasn't. He stood there for a moment, let the memories rise, then let them pass. He had nothing left to prove. Not to them. Not to the world. Not even to himself. He unlocked his apartment, turned on the light, and sat at his table. He reached for a new journal, the leather-bound one Kiara had given him after his first speaking event, and wrote one sentence. "I didn't come back to be the same." He closed the book, leaned back, and for the first time in decades, James Tillman felt something close to peace, not closure. That's a myth, but peace, the kind that comes when truth finally outruns the lie. It took 18 years, 2 denied appeals, and one miracle of DNA evidence to free James Tillman. By the time he walked out, his mother was gone. His little sister was grown. His youth, erased. They gave him a settlement check? A public apology? A handshake? But how do you refund someone's entire life? The worst part, the real perpetrator was identified, but never charged. This isn't just a story about James. It's a warning. If the wrong man can lose everything this easily, how many others are still locked up, waiting for the truth to matter? If you believe in justice, share this story. Because someone else out there, right now, is still waiting for someone to notice. Subscribe for more true stories like this. Thumbs up, leave a comment if this case made you feel something. Loudspeaker share to demand accountability.